DeFeo has written extensively about railroads, authoring several unique railroading books, including Histories of the Atlanta Northern Railway, the Memphis, Clarksville, and Louisville Railroad, and the Western and Atlantic Railroad. His presentations include rare and well-researched anecdotes to bring the stories of those affected by railroad mishaps to life. He is the publisher and editor of railfanning.org. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Todd DeFeo to the Georgia Archives.
I can't wait to meet this Todd DeFeo guy. He sounds very impressive. I guess you're just stuck with me then. A little bit of humor. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I got a brief presentation on oddities on the Georgia rails, I think it's called. The slide says this is a little PowerPoint humor. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I thought what we could do is I'd walk through my presentation, and then if you have any questions, if you wouldn't mind just folding them to the end, I'd be happy to take any questions at the end because I don't want to lose my train of thought. Drum kit to do that moving forward. We'll get that for next time. So we are, as everyone might have noticed, we are between two major holiday periods. And when we think of travel, holiday travel periods, we tend to think of what? Chaos? Probably fair. We've got weather delays. We've got security checkpoints. We've got the travelers themselves, right? It tends to make traveling a little bit of a chaotic experience sometimes today. And while we tend to think of travel as an adventure, if that's even the right word, alligators usually don't play into the equation, do they? I've never been to Hartsfield and seen an alligator. Is that fair to say? I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's not part of the norm. Well, in Atlanta in 1901, there was one main train station, and that was Union Depot, located in what we might consider 5 Points today. And while it looks nice in this postcard, it was not necessarily the highest regarded of train depots in history. And in fact, the Atlanta Constitution derided it at one point in time, calling it a dismal swamp. So if you can imagine, also just realized
It's located in Atlanta.
in Atlanta in 5 Points. There we go. That's also a view of Union Depot in 5 Points. And if you can imagine, on October 26th of 1901, it really lived up to its reputation that day. A gentleman by the name of W.L. McManus, he was a telegraph operator who worked at the depot, was going about his normal business when he discovered a 1.5 foot long alligator inside the train station. How the alligator came there needs no asking, the local newspaper said. The fame of the depot has traveled far and wide, and the fact that it was a spot unfitted for human beings, but admirably adapted to all creeping and crawling creatures, must have reached the sunny banks of some Florida stream where this particular alligator was having more competition than he cared for. That's how the local newspaper described the incident. And as if finding the alligator inside a train depot wasn't weird enough, the discovery set off an even more bizarre sequence of events. News spread throughout the city, and men clad and armed with hunting instruments of various sorts arrived at Union Depot to scour for other creatures that must be lurking in the shadows. However, the depot's guards ordered that the hunters had to leave before they could confirm what else might be inside the depot. And I share this anecdote to begin with because when we think of railroads, we tend to think of institutions that transformed, certainly Georgia, but the entire country. And railroads absolutely did. They absolutely transformed society as we knew it at the time. But railroads involved people. And people could sometimes verge on maybe the odd, to be polite. And when we think of rail travel, we tend to think of it as glamorous, streamlined coaches, glorious train stations. But as we're going to find out today, that wasn't always the case. And in fact, railroad operations were quite often less than smooth affairs. Monday, April 30th, 1900. If anybody's familiar with railroad history, you might know this as the day of Casey Jones' famous wreck in Vaughn, Mississippi. But I don't want to go to Vaughn, Mississippi today. I want to go 375 miles away from Vaughn, Mississippi, to the Hall County community of Belmont. And on that particular day, it probably seemed like a fairly normal day for the passengers on the Gainesville, Jefferson, and Southern Railroad. And in Belmont, what happened is two trains would meet. One train was coming from Gainesville and another train coming from Social Circle. And what the trains would do is the locomotives on each train would swap, and they would move from one train to the other train. And as you might imagine, on this particular day, the locomotive switch was anything but smooth. As the crew changed the locomotive, a passenger car somehow detached from one of the trains. There were about 9 or 10 people on this particular passenger coach, and they went on the wildest ride that they couldn't have expected, and nor did they pay extra for. And if we look at the collection of passengers who were on this particular coach, it must have sounded like the start of a bad joke. We had a newspaper editor, we had the sheriff, and we had a prisoner, and they all get on board a runaway train coach. With each second that passed, the speed of the car increased, and it soon became apparent that a wreck was almost a certainty. That's how the Athens Daily Banner reported the incident. With nervous excitement, all on board the train waited to crash, as they fully knew it was just ahead, and yet it was safer by far to remain on the train than to take a reckless plunge into the darkness. Despite the obvious danger, the mail clerk and the express manager decided to take matters into their own hands. After the car had traveled about 2 miles, they decided to jump to safety. And they did so and suffered only minor injuries. Now, at this point, I can't imagine what the rest of the passengers on the train must have been thinking. Should I also jump? What are these two folks who jumped? What do they know that I don't know? And so they're sitting there. The runaway car continues its journey for about another 2 miles. And that included a trek over a high trestle over Walnut Creek. And shortly past the trestle, the runaway coach encountered a sharp curve where it jumped the track. The coach, as you might imagine, was badly damaged, the track torn up, and several passengers were injured, but no one was killed somehow. Now, the reports don't say whether the railroad required them to pay fare for their journey back to Belmont to continue their trip to wherever they were going. I don't know, it doesn't say what they did, but I personally probably would have sought some alternative form of transportation. I'm not sure I'd get back on a train. And if anybody knows the history of the Gainesville, Jefferson, and Southern, which went on and lived for years as the Gainesville Midland, you might recognize that this could actually qualify as the high point of the railroad's operations. If you could pick one moment in history that aptly summed up the Gainesville, Jefferson, and Southern, it might actually be a runaway train in 1900. Gainesville, Jefferson, and Southern, perhaps that's a good topic for another day. And now, we're talking about runaway trains here. Now, you're probably thinking, and fairly so, I would say, we tend to think of runaway trains as a negative, right? That's generally a negative. But if you were a convict or a prisoner in the Coal City convict camp in Trenton, Georgia, around the turn of the century, you might actually look at a runaway train as the ticket to freedom. And that's exactly what happened for 3 inmates at the Coal City convict camp during late September 1893. But that's not where this particular story begins. On August 20th, 1891, 3 individuals, David B. Horton, Josh B. Braswell, and Ben Thornton, robbed the express car of mail train number 13 on the Central Railroad at Collier Station near Barnesville. The men boarded the Atlanta-bound train when it stopped to let a passenger disembark. The 3 ordered the train's messenger to open the safe. The messenger complied, and the robbers purportedly made off with $2,500. I know what you might be thinking. These guys sound like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. This is a well-oiled machine. I am here to tell you that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, these robbers were not. They were so eager to board their train that they were about to rob that they dropped a lantern. Good police detective work at the time discovered that the lantern had some lime residue on it. Well, it turns out that the three men had previously been ejected from a freight train. They were riding in a car filled with lime. Also, making matters worse for these three robbers is they had a connection to the railroad. Braswell was a carpenter, Thornton was a news butcher, and Horton was an extra fireman on the very railroad that he robbed. He earned roughly $25 to $30 a month for his work as an extra fireman. And when he arrived home with the money from the robbery, he told his wife that he won it in the lottery. The men were, as I referenced a moment ago, quickly apprehended. And the story just gets stranger. Because after about 2 months after the robbery, after the three were apprehended, but before they had gone to trial, authorities arrested two other men, a Will and a Fred Horton. They were the brothers of David Horton. And they were suspected of setting fire to bridges over the Oconee Swamp along the Central Railroad. It was revenge for the railroad's efforts in apprehending their brother. The three men involved in the express robbery pleaded guilty in November of 1891. They were sentenced, Thornton was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Braswell and David Horton were sentenced to 5. And in December of 1891, they were sent to serve their sentences in the Dade coal mine. Will and Fred Horton were subsequently sentenced to life in prison for attempting to burn down bridges. But that's not where this story ends for a couple of our folks that we've met so far, David Horton or Josh Braswell. In September of 1893, the two of them, along with a third man, Joe Simmons, who was also serving a 5-year sentence for an unrelated robbery in McIntosh County, they had decided they didn't like the Dade coal mines anymore. And they decided that they were going to seek residence elsewhere. Simmons and Braswell were working in the machine shop at noon on this particular Wednesday. Separately, Horton secured a crowbar and entered the guards' quarters and took a pistol and a Winchester rifle. He and Simmons then started walking to a caboose that was on the railroad track near the building. Braswell joined them, and the three made it for this rail car. Now, luckily for these three, the railroad was on a bit of a grade, and all they had to do was release the caboose's brake. And in doing so, the car went at a furious speed down the mountainside, and they rode this runaway caboose to freedom. When the guards realized what had happened, they secured an engine and pursued. The three convicts left the caboose about a mile from the mines and apparently took to the woods. A reward of $100 was offered for their return. As you might imagine, their freedom didn't last very long. About 2 weeks later, a Rome police officer caught up with the trio, acting on a tip from a tramp. The officer and a posse found the men hiding along the Etowah River. As the lawmen approached, the convicts opened fire. Horton was wounded in the exchange, but continued to fire until he fell to the ground, left for dead. Braswell was captured and Simmons escaped. The Floyd County coroner arrived to hold an inquest for Horton, but they found that he was still alive. And the authorities transported him to Rome, where he did eventually succumb to his injuries. The officer, a patrolman by the name of C.M. Alexander, picked up $200 in reward money for his efforts. Now, to have a little bit of fun today, I decided I'd employ AI to help create a visual of this escape. This is what it came up with. I'm not sure it's the best depiction, but I think I'm actually going to print it out. I'm going to hang it over my fireplace. I think this is pretty good. And if anyone gets the reference, the words on here, I look forward to Kurt Russell playing Snake Horton. I think it landed. That's good. But even the building of railroads at times could seem like a comedy of errors. You would think, and when I began looking into railroads, I thought it'd be fair to think that railroads would work together, that they would want to build a great network that would benefit everybody. You would be wrong. Railroad leaders were often at odds. as I mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about people here. So when you put people into the equation, weird things happen. And consider that what happened in March of 1892. It involves the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which had purchased a warehouse at the lower end of Broad Street in downtown Rome. They wanted to turn this structure into their passenger terminal. The Richmond and Danville, which was a predecessor of the Southern Railway Company and what we know today as Norfolk Southern, just needed to cross some railroad tracks that happened to belong to the Rome Railroad. Once they did so, they could run their line to their new depot. If you think about it, railroads crossed incredible landscape. They tunneled, they crossed mountains, rivers. How hard could it be to cross some railroad tracks? So what the Richmond and Danville did is they sent a crew to Rome shortly after midnight. The engineer on the train that was pulling the crew decided we wouldn't sound the whistle. We don't want to alert anybody of what we're doing. A team under the supervision of H.R. Dill went to work, quickly laying tracks. And by morning, they had completed their task. On the surface, it might seem like this is a fairly impressive feat. They laid their tracks through town in a matter of a night. What could possibly go wrong? Oh, yeah, I think I forgot to mention that the Richmond and Danville didn't check with the Rome Railroad to make sure that it was okay to cross their railroad tracks. So if you could imagine what would happen, it wasn't too long before W. Brooks, who was the president of the Rome Railroad, learned of what the Richmond and Danville had done. He immediately went to the scene to confront Dill. "I will have you put in the penitentiary, sir," Brooks is recorded to have told Dill. What was Dill's response? You think, oh my gosh, they're going to come arrest me. He left it off. No big deal. My favorite is the description of this in a newspaper from Athens. "Intense excitement has prevailed over the matter all day, and Romans, eager to watch the scene, have assembled in hundreds about the place of work." A different world back then. People always would show up at train wrecks, and it's like rubbernecking, I guess, was the original form of it. Let's go see what's going on with this fight. When a reporter confronted Dill or asked Dill what time he expected to leave, he responded, "I expect to go on the 12:30 train unless I'm arrested." You see, they are trying to force us to buy their road. That is what this is all about. They told us this morning to keep off their tracks. We've been using them, you know. A short time later, Brooks actually made good on his promise. He swore out a warrant from a justice of the peace, and the Floyd County sheriff actually arrested Dill and threw him in jail. He quickly bonded out of jail, but a Superior Court judge had signed an injunction prohibiting the Richmond and Danville from doing additional work and required them to tear up the work that they had done and replace a Rome Railroad siding that workers had removed. What struck me as so odd about this particular narrative is, was there no middle ground? Was there no way to resolve the disagreement without involving the court system? Without throwing people in jail? We talk about the overloaded court system today. Not really a new phenomenon, I guess. There were frivolous lawsuits way back when and frivolous actions whenever. And I guess the short answer you might look at is say, when it involves people, it often devolves to the lowest common denominator. But of course, this little brouhaha was nothing compared to one in August of 1889, when Patrick Calhoun and John D. Williamson saw a war of words nearly turn deadly. The duel, if we can call it that, took place near Cedar Bluff, Alabama, and it went down in history as the last duel in Georgia. You did hear that right. The last duel in Georgia took place in Alabama. At the time, Calhoun, who was the grandson of John C. Calhoun, for anyone who goes back and knows history and goes to that era, was a prominent railroad attorney, and Williamson was the president of the Chattanooga, Rome, and Columbus Railroad. The disagreement, it appears, began during an August 8, 1889 hearing before the Railroad Committee of the Georgia House of Representatives. The committee was having a discussion on the Olive Bill, which I know we all know it very well, and we'll have a robust debate about it afterwards. The bill is actually almost irrelevant to the story. It would generally be centered on railroad consolidation and provided for the forfeiture of charters in some instances. But what matters is during this hearing, Williamson had stressed that the Chattanooga, Rome, and Columbus Railroad was an independent line, and Calhoun took credit for its independence, telling the lawmakers that he had actually barred another railroad, the Central of Georgia, from entering an agreement to take over the Chattanooga, Rome, and Columbus. According to Calhoun, Williamson wanted to appoint him as counsel and use his clout to offload the railroad. Following the hearing, Williamson adjourned to the Kimball House, a famed Atlanta hotel, while Calhoun returned to his office. Later, Calhoun sent a note to Williamson demanding that he retract the language that he used during the committee hearing. When they didn't reach a compromise, this is another great example of is there no middle ground. When they didn't reach a compromise, they agreed to a duel in Cedar Bluff, Alabama. It was like a Twitter war of words, except it involved handguns instead of hashtags. On Friday, August 9th, 1889, Calhoun and his party departed Atlanta. The following morning, Williamson and his entourage did the same. It might have qualified as this incredible cloak and dagger affair, except for the fact that it must have been the worst kept secret in all of Georgia. Newspaper reporters pursued the parties, hoping to cover the duel. And an Atlanta Constitution reporter named Ed Bruffy actually participated in preparing the weapons used in the duel, and in fact had his finger shot off shortly before the duel when he was preparing the weapons. The governors of Georgia and Alabama, of course, they worked to stop the duel once they learned of it. And in fact, at one point when they arrived in Cedar Bluff, the sheriff of Cherokee County, Alabama, was ready to make an arrest. All they needed to happen was for someone to identify Calhoun. So inevitably what happened? No one would identify Calhoun. Couldn't make an arrest, couldn't stop the duel. The party eventually decided it would relocate slightly east of Cedar Bluff along the Georgia-Alabama line. At 7:35 p.m., the men prepared for their showdown. Calhoun faced west. Williamson faced east. Henry Jackson accompanied Calhoun. Jack King accompanied Williamson. King then gave the command to start the duel. Williamson immediately fired the 5 shots in his pistol. All of them missed their mark. Calhoun responded by firing a single shot, which also missed his mark. Mr. Williamson, I have reserved 4 of my shots, and I now have the right to return fire, to fire them at you, Calhoun said. Williamson simply responded, I am ready to receive them. The two went back and forth, with Calhoun asking Williamson to withdraw his statement to the committee, and Williamson asking Calhoun to say that he didn't mean any personal reflection on him. Eventually, it got to the point where Williamson raised his pistol and said, it eventually got to the point where Calhoun raised his pistol and said, Mr. Williamson, in my remarks before the legislative committee, you did not personally enter my mind. I say this holding 4 shots in reserve, and when I have fired them in the air, I expect you to withdraw your remarks since I have made this statement. Calhoun then fired his 4 remaining shots into the air. Since you have stated that you meant nothing personal in your remarks, I now withdraw the statement made before the legislative committee, Williamson responded. The 2 men then shook hands. Let this be a matter of the past, Calhoun said. Williamson responded with, it shall be with me. You have shown yourself to be a man of courage, and I believe I have. You certainly have, Calhoun agreed. The 2 men went their separate ways. Despite an initial report that Williamson was wounded in the showdown, neither man was injured, because apparently they were all terrible shots. We tend to consider duels to be an extreme way to settle a dispute, but arguments throughout history have always had a way of escalating to violence. Did this pause for dramatic effect? In mid-November 1910, John Reynolds was motoring an Atlanta Northern Railway trolley at about 1:40 when it rounded a curve near the Ashby Street crossing in Atlanta. The trolley, number 300, struck a powder company's wagon. The wagon was carrying 8,000 pounds of dynamite. It was badly smashed, as the newspaper reported. It overturned, spilling sticks of dynamite onto the cobblestone streets. Yet somehow, the wagon did not explode, sparing the lives of conductor William C. Lindsay and wagon driver Harry Scarborough. While Reynolds and Lindsay escaped death on this particular November day, they were, a few years later, involved in one of the Atlanta Northern's stranger episodes, which transpired in the office of the company's car barn in Marietta. It was November 10th, 1914, during the early days of World War I and before the United States' involvement in the war to end all wars. Following the last run from Atlanta, the 50-year-old Reynolds and the 40-year-old Lindsay began arguing about the number of Germans killed in the fighting in Europe. Lindsay remarked that about 1,200 Germans had been killed, and Reynolds called him a liar. The only way that you could possibly describe it is as one newspaper did. The words became heated. Apparently, they could not amicably resolve their differences. Lindsay brandished a revolver and fired twice. Reynolds stumbled and fell to the floor, but he managed to pull out his own firearm, letting loose 3 shots. The local druggist, John Griffith, heard the gunfire and ran into the office, followed by L.O. Harrison, the night operator at the depot. But it was too late. Both men, who had worked together for years, lay mortally wounded. They also lived down the street from each other, I believe, so they had quite the explosive relationship that ended poorly for both. And I think these anecdotes are funny because they show how we remember, perhaps sometimes misremember, the past. And we think about railroad travel. We've been looking to improve railroad travel now for decades. Chatting before this presentation about potential changes that we could make to improve railroad travel. And if we talk about Amtrak, that's a entity that's been around for 50 years. And I thought about it this way: in the first 50 years of the country's railroad history, we built the Transcontinental Railroad. And I thought that was interesting because we even misremember the Transcontinental Railroad. It was certainly hugely impactful to the country, changed the country, changed how we moved. But what we sometimes forget is that railroads needed to upgrade much of the line soon after it was opened to make it work for their needs. I think we tend to have a collective image of railroads, and we think of the golden age of travel as a glamorous means of moving from one point to another. We tend to think of the deluxe coaches, the fine dining. I think we want to think that it still is today. But I'm always struck by, when we tend to want to think of rail as a great way to travel, why don't we take it more? Why don't we use rail travel more? We as in the royal we in this particular instance. And I started thinking back as I pulled this presentation and other presentations I've pulled together as well, that we misremember the glory days of railroads in some ways. Yes, it was hugely impactful. It absolutely changed communities up and down the lines. It changed how we got goods to market. It changed how we were able to go from point A to point B. But I also started thinking about that Billy Joel lyric, because the good old days weren't always good. And I think you could apply that to railroads. There were certainly some great days. There were some terrible days on railroads. I do a lot of presentations on death on the rails and people who were killed in various accidents and mishaps. And it was incredible the number of ways people could meet their demise on a railroad. And as what I hope these anecdotes today have shown, there was also some weird things that happened on railroads over the years. And I started thinking about another industry as well. I started thinking about newspapers. I began my career as a newspaper reporter. That's probably why I like to dig and investigate and look for interesting stories. And when I entered the profession, I thought that newspapers were still in their heyday, so to speak. And I was really excited to help elevate them and take them to the next level. And I realized in some ways, the best days of the newspapers maybe had already passed. And when I started writing railroad histories a few years ago, I started looking at a lot of old newspapers. And I realized newspapers were always unique, and maybe they never had a heyday. Maybe we've always just misremembered the past about railroads and newspapers. Another historian contacted me not long ago asking about a particular railroad. He was concerned that its operations were, I'm going to put it polite, dreadful. In short, he concluded that this railroad that he was looking into couldn't serve the community he was researching. I responded with something to the effect of, that's just railroads. They were pretty horrible. They killed a lot of people. They generally didn't run on time. People always complained about them. And what I didn't add, but could have, maybe putting it more simply, is a lot of weird stuff happened on railroads over the years. I think when we look at railroads, sometimes we look at it through a little bit of rose-colored spectacles, if that's fair. I think we tend to do that a lot when we look back in history. And I can't tell you how many times I go to presentations where people will chat, they'll either ask a question or talk to me afterwards, kind of lamenting the fact that we don't have railroads. And I find it kind of funny. The Atlanta Northern is a great example of that. It's a streetcar interurban line that ran from downtown Atlanta to downtown Marietta. Could you imagine that today? It took 50 minutes to go from one end to the other. What does that take today? We debate that later. It could take hours to do that same journey today. We had that. And the entire time, all the riders wanted was another form of transportation. They wanted a bus. They complained about the schedules of the line. And so I find it funny because we sit here today and say, we would love that. If you were to talk to our counterparts from 100 years ago, they would say, I hate this. Can't we get something else? They'd probably be envious of the highway system that we have. So I think our perspectives change over time. I mean, it's fair to say that our perspectives change over time. What they wanted, maybe we have today to some degree. We don't want it. We want what they had. And I just find it particularly interesting because, we lament these not having these particular options for travel. And when we had them, we just complained and wanted a better way to travel. We've talked for years about building a new train station in this town to build additional rail network and additional rail capacity. And the one we had 120 years ago, the best way to describe it in the local newspaper was a dismal swamp. It had an alligator in it, which made me wonder one very important question. If and when we build our new Union Station here or build our new station here in Atlanta, is the alligator standard or is that a bonus feature that we have to upgrade? So with that, I thought I could take some questions if anybody had any particular questions they'd like to ask.
Yes. One of the things you haven't mentioned is the great locomotive chase.
It was great. It was fantastic. One of the best ever. What would you like to know about it?
Well, see that Union soldiers came down with Mr. Andrews.
Mr. Andrews, James,
and tried to steal which was it? The general. And we're not quite successful.
Close.
And
Not that close.
It happened on the first anniversary of the firing on Fort Sumter.
It's true.
So can you add anything else?
Not much. I can. I thought about actually making that a centerpiece of this, and I opted not to. It is a pretty hilarious one. You are correct. What I find most funny or perhaps odd, are we oddities on the railroad or weirdness on the railroad? Yeah, exactly. Oddities. So we'll call it odd. I want to use the right nomenclature, verbiage here. is if you could imagine, this train left Atlanta at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it got to what was then known as Big Shanty, Kennesaw today, at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And what's hilarious about it to me is that was the breakfast stop. If you have to think back, this is an era where there were no dining cars. So you couldn't just run and, grab a Chick-fil-A sandwich or whatever you might have at that particular point in time. So everybody got off the train when it got to Big Shanty. Maybe not everybody, but most people got off the train. And when I say most people got off the train, I mean the locomotive engineer, the fireman, the conductor, everybody got off the train. It was as if they had left the keys in the car. There weren't keys for the locomotive, so they couldn't have left the keys in it, but you get the approach anyway. And the Union spies got off the train. Sure, they were checking over their shoulder, making sure nobody's following them. Literally, a couple of them got up in the cab of the locomotive. The rest of them got in, there were 3 boxcars immediately behind the locomotive, and literally pulled back on the throttle and stole the locomotive in 3 boxcars. The funnier part is not that. The funnier part is what happened next, I would imagine. And what happened next really depends on what version of the story you want to believe. We'll go with the most popular version of it. The conductor, this is a gentleman named William A. Fuller, stood up and said something to the effect of, "Someone who has no right has gone off with my train." I am guessing, I wasn't there, I don't know. I think it was probably a little bit more colorful than that, but that's how history remembers it. When you write your version of history, you can write whatever you said or want to be remembered as saying. And the funniest part was everyone seemed to be running around in circles, kind of like with chickens with their heads cut off, I guess is the saying you might use. And eventually they decided to run after the train, which, again, depending on which version of the story you want to believe, everyone on the ground thought was the funniest thing they had ever seen, because these people stole a locomotive who nobody there knew who they were at that point in time. They thought they were deserters from a Confederate camp that was across the tracks. And these idiots are running after a train as if they're ever going to catch up to it. Well, the crazy part is they caught up to it, commandeering other locomotives, running. They had a pole car that they could use at one point in time it literally had no locomotion on it itself, but you had a pole that you literally would push yourself on the ground, and they ran all the way up to Ringgold, just north of Ringgold, and were able to capture the locomotive. I can go deeper. Do you have other questions on the Great Locomotive Chase?
Some of the details you might include is that 2 guys overslept.
2 guys overslept, true.
And I think 2 of them went down the Chattahoochee River.
There were a couple of them. They ultimately went to prison. They were mostly caught. These are also the first Medal of Honor recipients. And if you go to, there's a great museum in Marietta. You can actually go stand in the room. They stayed at the hotel in Marietta, Georgia. It's the Kennesaw House. It's the Marietta Museum of History. I think it might have changed its name slightly, so don't quote me on the exact name of it, but you can actually stand in the room where they stayed the night before, and you can overlook this very same train tracks that are still there today. And another little, it's not really odd per se, but another little anecdote. I won't do a show of hands, but I presume everybody here pays taxes in Georgia. We'll just presume. I'm not the tax man, so it doesn't matter to me. It's just a joke. I'm just kidding for the tax man watching. If you do, you own a railroad, because this particular railroad, which was when it was built, and I guess technically still is the Western and Atlantic Railroad. It was built by the state of Georgia. It's owned by the state of Georgia, and since 1870, it's been leased, and since 1890, it's effectively been leased to the same company, which is today CSX Transportation. But yes, a couple of folks, couple didn't even make it to Marietta. There were 2 who didn't even make it to Marietta. There were 2 who didn't tip the porter enough, is I think how the story goes, and didn't wake them up. And so they literally showed up at the train station watching their train disappearing down the tracks. The other part that's actually really hilarious about this story that most people don't realize, these trains operated on wood at this point in time. It wasn't coal, it wasn't diesel fuel or anything, it was wood. And they would have to stop frequently, every couple miles, to actually put more wood on the train to keep burning. So what is kind of forgotten in this history of the rail locomotive chase is there were multiple stops every 2 miles between Kennesaw and Ringgold.
Issue with gauge, railroad size gauge in Georgia.
Not an issue per se.
Standard by the time there was much building done in Georgia of the rails.
No, is the short answer to the beginning part of it, but it's a little deeper than that. So railroad trains today are 4 feet, 8.5 inches is the standard gauge. It's the distance between the two rails. Most of the railroads in the South before the Civil War were built at 5-foot gauge. They were built 5 feet apart. There were some differences, different railroads, but Southern railroads were generally built at about 5 feet apart. After the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, that's ultimately what created the standard gauge. They built it to a gauge, so everyone else who wanted interchange with that railroad needed to build it the same gauge, which ended up being 4 feet, 8.5 inches. There was a movement, particularly in the 1880s, and I referenced the Gainesville, Jefferson, and Southern. I think I'm correct on this. I think it's fair to say that was actually built as a narrow gauge initially, and a narrow gauge is 3 feet between the rails. And there were a bunch of railroads in the 1880s. I wrote a book on one up in Tennessee and Kentucky. Aptly, the railroad was named the Indiana, Alabama, and Texas, but they built in Kentucky and Tennessee. It's a different story for a different day, as they say. You could build them cheaper was one of the reasons people started building at 3-foot gauge. It never really caught on. And what they ended up doing was in the 1880s, when they changed everything to standard gauge, they literally would take one rail, move it over a few inches, make it a little narrower by about 3 inches. I believe the Louisville Natural actually used 4 feet 9-inch gauge, which is not 4 feet 8.5 inches. I know it's different, but it's close enough that the trains could go between the two. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but eventually it got there. It didn't really cause any problems per se, but the ultimate problem would be if you're on the standard gauge and you go to the 5-foot gauge, you would have to take everything off the train, off one car, put it on, if it's in a boxcar, take everything off one boxcar, put it on another boxcar. Nowadays, there are some, you can actually change the bogies, the wheels on the bottom of a train car, and actually, you can not even have to change things from one car to another. And sometimes you can actually do it while going down the tracks. But in the 1880s, that was technology that was nowhere in sight yet.
I read an article that said that the gauge was dependent on the Roman chariot.
It's the rumor. There's a couple iterations of how it began. Others have said it's the width of was a 2 ox, I guess, for a cart, or maybe 1 ox for a cart from even earlier times. That was the width of it. There's a lot of theories on exactly why that is. It could also just be random, is another theory that people have put out there. But
and I've also heard a rumor that Marta is buying new train cars.
for MARTA,
Yeah,
they are.
and that the gauge of the car is not the same as the tracks.
That I haven't heard.
Okay.
They're buying new cars. They're supposed to start showing up. I can't get next year, but I don't know if it's January or what time next year. I'll have to ask them if the gauge is different. That I don't know. They're built by a company out of Europe. It's Statler is the name of the company that's building it. And they're replacing all of their fleet. And they actually donated one of their very first cars up to the museum in Duluth, the Southeastern Railway Museum up in Duluth. You can see it on display up there.
But this could seriously slow down the changeover if they have to change the rail cars.
I'm making a note because I'm going to look into that because that's an interesting. I want to say that something similar happened in France. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. I'm going off memory here, the time frame where the trains were actually too wide. If I'm remembering correctly, the loading gauge was wrong and they couldn't pull at the stations. And they bought a bunch of these new trains. And it's a shame that nobody has developed some kind of store where you can go and get some sort of device that would tell you the width to make sure that your cars are the right width. One day somebody's going to come up with this. So if somebody out there is watching, maybe YouTube can invent such a store. Questions. I got answers all day. They may not match your question, but I have answered.
You interested in railroads to start with?
How long do you have?
We got time. They're filming out there.
So I grew up in a wonderful place called New Jersey. If you've seen the drones lately, that's the place that it's flying over. I grew up along the Northeast Corridor, a little town that was on the Northeast Corridor is the main train line that now really goes from Boston down to Washington, D.C. It was one of the main ways. I always thought it was the main way in and out of New York City. To me, it still is the main way in and out of New York City. I'm sorry if you live on one of the other lines in and out of New York City. I used to go down, watch trains. I commuted in and out of the city, and so I'd get to know a lot of the different conductors over the years. I've always enjoyed watching trains. For some strange reason, I decided to major in history when I went to college, which I did. For an even stranger reason, I decided to become a writer. And then for the strangest of reasons, maybe odd is the word I should use, I decided to merge all my hobbies together, railroads, writing. I started writing books, and then I started presenting on those books. And then I came to the state archives, and you came to the state archives.
So what city were you born in?
Metuchen.
Oh, okay.
I was born in Edison, but Metuchen.
Stayed a night over there.
Great city.
Yeah.
Did you have a question in the back?
I heard about 10 years ago in Washington DC, they got new subway trains and it rattled the buildings or vibrated the buildings that were close to the tracks. I guess they were more powerful engines or something.
It could be. It could be. We were at the subway. I'm trying to think of where we were sitting somewhere. It's one of the things you would think that they would, I don't know about that particular example. It's probably true. We say that because it's incredible the amount of things that sometimes people forget to think about when they make changes or upgrades or change cars, how it's going to react to the infrastructure that's in place. Sometimes they're louder, sometimes they're quieter. There's so many potential changes that you would think that everyone would think through, but sometimes they forget to measure the gauge of the train cars and they don't fit. Well, I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone wants to answer your question. Otherwise, happy to do so.